The ballroom glittered with gold and crystal, a place where only the elite dared to stand. The laughter and clinking glasses around Tobi Adewale felt distant, almost muffled, as if the life in the room was happening in a world far removed from his own. He sat at the head of the table, his back straight, his hands clasped politely in his lap, but his mind was 1,000 miles away. Amara, his wife of 10 years, was beside him, looking like the perfect picture of elegance. Her smile was radiant as she leaned toward him, whispering something in his ear, her perfume sweet in the air. She was beautiful, accomplished, the epitome of grace. Yet when she touched his hand it felt like ice. His stomach twisted, but he forced a smile, turning his head toward her, nodding as if her words meant something, anything. His lips moved in practiced politeness, and she responded with a smile of her own, completely unaware. How could she know? How could anyone understand what had become of him? The grand ballroom around them hummed with the energy of celebration, of people enjoying life, their laughter full of the joy that Tobi no longer felt. Yet all Tobi could hear was the dull thrum of his own pulse, the overwhelming emptiness of it all. The world was moving in high definition while he was stuck in a gray, silent haze. He had everything, wealth, status, a beautiful wife, but it all felt like sand slipping through his fingers. Amara, completely unaware of the cold distance that was creeping between them, laughed brightly at something one of their guests said. It wasn't the first time Tobi had noticed the cracks in their marriage, but tonight, it felt more pronounced. There was no passion in her gaze, no connection in the touch of her hand. How had things gotten this way? When had he stopped feeling? It wasn't just her touch that felt like nothing, it was everything. The years of their marriage had somehow melted away, leaving only the bitter aftertaste of routine. Their intimacy, once a shared joy, had become a ghost of its former self. The passionate nights, the stolen moments of affection, they were long gone. Now there was only silence and distance, and he had no idea how to bridge the gap. Amara smiled again, her laughter ringing through the air like a distant bell, but Tobi couldn't bring himself to engage. His mind wandered, searching for any semblance of connection, any spark of life to reignite him. Nothing came. "Excuse me," he muttered, his voice tight. He stood up suddenly, pushing his chair back so violently that it scraped across the marble floor, drawing the attention of the guests nearby. They all turned toward him, startled by the sudden movement. Tobi didn't care. He needed air. He needed to escape. He walked briskly toward the exit, the ballroom doors swinging shut behind him, muffling the laughter and chatter. The cool, quiet hallway was a welcome relief from the noise, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside his chest. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He just needed to get away from everything. The restroom was empty when he entered. The stark white tiles and cold, sterile air felt almost like a cruel joke. Tobi stood in front of the mirror, his reflection staring back at him with eyes that had grown distant, detached. His face was still handsome, still the image of the billionaire playboy he had built himself to be, but there was no life in those eyes. They were dull, lifeless. He ran a hand through his hair, the weight of his own existence pressing down on him. The world outside was still spinning, but he felt like he was stuck in a void, frozen in time. How long had it been since he had felt anything? "What's wrong with me?" he whispered to the mirror. The words came out softly, almost a prayer, but there was no answer. Only the cold, indifferent reflection staring back at him. He closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. He wasn't weak. He wasn't broken. But then why did it feel like everything he had built, the wealth, the family, the life, had become nothing more than an illusion? The sound of laughter filtered through the walls, breaking his thoughts. It was a bright, carefree sound, one that seemed out of place in the oppressive quiet of his mind. He turned, straining to listen. Was it someone in the hallway? His thoughts snapped back to reality. Zara. She had just returned from studying abroad, and her laughter was unmistakable. He hadn't expected her back tonight, not when he was drowning in this suffocating sense of disconnect, but there it was, her laugh echoing through the halls like a beacon in the dark. For a moment, it felt like the weight on his chest lifted just a little. Something inside him stirred, something he hadn't felt in months. Zara. The name tasted strange on his tongue, and as he stood there, he felt a pang of discomfort twist in his gut. Why was he reacting like this? Why did her laugh, so pure, so light, make his heart skip a beat? He couldn't explain it. He didn't want to. All he knew was that it felt like something had broken through the frozen wall inside him, and for the first time in what felt like years, something inside him was alive again. Tobi walked to the door, pausing for just a moment before stepping into the hallway. Zara's voice grew louder as she approached. carrying with it the warmth of a life he'd long since forgotten. He didn't know why, but something about her presence, her energy, brought him back to life. It felt like a shock to his system, as if the world had suddenly gone from black and white to full color. And then she appeared in the doorway, suitcase in hand, her face lit up with that radiant smile he remembered from the last time they'd met. The years apart hadn't changed her. If anything, she seemed to glow even brighter now, her youth and vitality a stark contrast to the weight of years that had settled onto his own shoulders. "Uncle Toby," she said, her voice teasing, a lightness in her tone. "Don't you look serious?" Her eyes met his, and for a moment the world seemed to stop moving. Toby's breath caught in his throat as he stared at her. There it was again, an inexplicable pull, a connection he couldn't name. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he gave a small, forced smile, the same smile he'd been practicing all night. But it felt different this time, heavier somehow, as if something was shifting beneath the surface. Zara walked past him, unbothered by his silence, but Toby remained frozen. His heart raced as he watched her go, her presence lingering in the air like a spark that refused to be snuffed out. She disappeared down the hallway, but the effect she had on him remained. Toby stood there for a long moment, his mind spinning, his body locked in place. What the hell was happening to him? Why did Zara, his wife's younger sister, affect him this way? It was impossible. He couldn't, no he shouldn't, feel this way. But there it was, unmistakable, undeniable. A shift he couldn't control. And as the laughter from the other room filtered back to him, Toby stood in the hallway, frozen in place, trying to make sense of what was happening inside him. Toby sat at the breakfast table, his fork hovering midair, his gaze fixed on the eggs in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. His fingers trembled slightly, an unusual sign of agitation, but he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled within him since Zara's return. Her laughter still lingered in the back of his mind, bright and carefree, a stark contrast to the cold, distant hum of his marriage. He glanced at Amara, who sat across from him, flipping through her phone with disinterest. Her face was as perfect as ever, her beauty untouched by the years that had passed between them, but the distance was palpable. Her fingers moved with the precision of habit, scrolling through emails or checking the latest news. Toby had once found comfort in her composed, orderly nature, but now it felt suffocating. She was here, physically present but emotionally absent. He wondered briefly if she ever felt the same way, if she too was slowly slipping away from the connection they once had. But it wasn't just her absence that had him unsettled, it was Zara. Zara, with her easy smile and infectious laugh, had been back for only a few days, and already she was making Toby feel things he had long buried beneath layers of business, obligation and routine. He could feel the pull of her energy, her warmth, and it was beginning to stir something inside him. A longing, a hunger he hadn't experienced in years. "Are you all right, Toby?" Amara's voice broke through his thoughts. Her eyes, though sharp, had softened with concern, but it was the kind of concern that felt more like a duty than a genuine emotion. She had always been like that, caring but distant. He was used to it, but now, in the quiet of the morning, it felt like a crack in the foundation. "I'm fine," he said quickly, his voice betraying none of the tension building inside him. "Just tired. I didn't sleep well." Amara nodded, returning to her phone. She didn't push further, and Toby was thankful for that. He didn't want to explain that he couldn't sleep because his mind was racing with thoughts of Zara, thoughts that made him feel guilty and confused. Zara was his wife's sister. She was off limits, an unspoken rule that had always been clear. But in the past few days, that line had blurred in ways he didn't know how to handle. He finished his breakfast quickly, his mind already running through the day's meetings and deadlines. His usual routine. But as he stood to leave, a sudden voice interrupted his thoughts. "Good morning, Uncle Toby." Toby froze. He hadn't heard Zara enter the room, but there she was, standing at the door with a warm smile and a cup of coffee in her hand. She was dressed casually in a simple sweater and jeans, but the way she stood, with that unguarded warmth in her eyes, made her seem like the most alive person in the room. Her presence made the air feel lighter, and for a moment, Toby felt like he could breathe again. It wasn't just her appearance, it was the energy she exuded. Zara had always been the younger sister, the one who had gone abroad to study, the one who had been distant for so many years. But now she was back, and it felt like the world was suddenly more vivid, more real. "Good morning," Toby replied, his voice softer than he intended. He found himself smiling at her without even thinking about it, a real smile that didn't feel forced. It was the kind of smile he hadn't given anyone in months, not even Amara. Zara didn't seem to notice the oddity in his tone, or perhaps she didn't care. She simply moved to the counter and began making herself a cup of tea. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder as she prepared her drink. The casual question seemed so simple, yet it hit him with the force of a revelation. Zara wasn't just polite, she was interested in him. She cared about his well-being in a way that felt genuine, unlike the polite formality that defined his interactions with Amara. Tobi opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. Instead, he cleared his throat, his mind working faster than his mouth could follow. He had to remind himself that she was family, that she was the last person he should be thinking about in this way. "Fine," he said finally, his voice a little too clipped. "Just a long night." Zara turned back to face him, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. There was something about the way she looked at him, so open, so unguarded, that made him feel exposed. He didn't like it, but at the same time he couldn't look away. "Well, I hope you can rest today," she said with a smile that made his chest tighten. "If you need anything, just let me know." Tobi nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Zara moved around the kitchen, making small talk with Amara, but Tobi couldn't focus on anything but her presence. It was like he had forgotten how to interact with people on a basic level. His wife, Amara, who had been his partner for a decade, was now a ghost in the background, while Zara filled the space in ways that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Later that day, Tobi tried to focus on work, but his mind kept wandering. He couldn't stop thinking about Zara, about how her laugh still echoed in his head, about the way she moved with such ease and confidence. It was a far cry from the icy perfection of Amara, who always seemed to carry the weight of control with her every step. He didn't know why it was affecting him so deeply. Why now? Why after all these years? The more he tried to suppress his thoughts, the more they grew. He found himself glancing toward the door, wondering if Zara would come by again, if he could catch just one more moment of her warmth. By the time dinner came, Tobi was exhausted, not from work, but from the emotional whirlwind that had been building inside him all day. The tension between him and Zara was impossible to ignore now. Every time their eyes met, the air seemed to thicken, charged with something neither of them could name. At dinner, Zara sat next to him and it felt both right and wrong. The conversation flowed easily, with Zara laughing at jokes Tobi had long stopped finding funny. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time in years, Tobi felt himself being pulled out of his shell. He was actually enjoying himself. He hadn't realized how much he missed laughing, how much he missed feeling alive. But then, Zara told a story about her time abroad, something humorous about her adventures in New York City, and the entire room erupted in laughter. Tobi, caught off guard by her energy, laughed louder than he meant to. And then their eyes met across the table. The connection was instantaneous, like a spark that flared and threatened to ignite. The moment stretched for too long, just a second but enough for Tobi to feel his heart race and his palms sweat. He forced himself to look away, clearing his throat, but it was too late. Amara, who had been quiet for most of the meal, looked up, her sharp eyes flicking between them. Tobi felt a pang of guilt, but the connection with Zara was undeniable. And as the evening drew to a close, Tobi found himself thinking about her more than he should. He couldn't explain it. He didn't want to. That night, as Tobi lay in bed, Amara beside him, sleep eluded him. He could feel the weight of his thoughts pressing on him, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw Zara's face, the way her smile had lit up the room, the way her eyes had held his. He turned toward Amara, her back to him as she slept soundly. He reached for her, but it felt wrong. There was no spark, no warmth. He pulled his hand back, staring at the ceiling, the reality of his life settling on him like a heavy blanket. He couldn't keep pretending. Something inside him had shifted. He had no idea where it would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. His life was no longer as simple as it had seemed before Zara came back. The silence between Tobi and Amara had become a quiet storm, simmering under the surface of their daily lives. They sat together at the breakfast table, yet the distance between them felt as wide as an ocean. Amara, as always, looked perfect, elegant, composed, but there was a coldness in her eyes that Tobi could no longer ignore. He found himself studying her, searching for something, anything, that might explain the growing distance, but he found nothing. Her perfection had once been something he admired, even cherished, but now it felt like a wall. The smile she offered him as she sipped her coffee was polite, detached, a formality more than an expression of love. It felt rehearsed. He stared at his coffee cup, watching the steam curl up in delicate tendrils, but his mind wasn't on the warm brew in front of him. It was on Zara. Her face, her laugh, the way she moved with such ease, it all replayed in his head, a constant loop he couldn't escape. Amara cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "Tobi, are you listening?" He blinked, torn from his thoughts, and glanced at her. Her eyes, sharp as ever, were watching him, waiting for a response. "Sorry, what did you say?" His voice was quieter than he intended. Amara raised an eyebrow, clearly not pleased. "You've been distant lately. Is something wrong? You've been on edge ever since Zara came back." Tobi felt a jolt of discomfort shoot through him, but he quickly masked it with a neutral expression. He couldn't let her see the storm brewing inside him. "Not yet." "I'm fine," he said quickly, forcing the words out, but they felt like a lie hanging heavy in his mouth. "You're never fine when you're fine," Amara replied, her tone cool, but not without a touch of concern. "You've been distracted for days. It's not business, is it?" Tobi shook his head. "No. Just tired, like I said." She studied him for a long moment, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You should take it easy. You're working yourself too hard." He nodded absently, but his mind was elsewhere. If Amara only knew the real reason for his distraction, she'd never understand. He couldn't bring himself to tell her that it was Zara, her sister, who had become the object of his constant thoughts. He couldn't tell her how every interaction with Zara left him feeling both guilty and alive, both excited and terrified. Zara, with her warmth, her genuine curiosity, was the exact opposite of Amara. She wasn't polished or cold or detached. Zara was open, unafraid to laugh, to share, to be herself. And with every moment Tobi spent around her, the cracks in his marriage became more pronounced, more obvious. The days that followed felt like they were slipping through his fingers, each one blending into the next. Tobi tried to focus on work, to immerse himself in the things that once held his attention, but his mind always drifted back to Zara. He'd catch himself thinking about her laugh, her eyes, the way she looked at him with a kind of innocence he hadn't seen in years. During their family dinners, he found himself watching her more often than he should. She was lively, always quick with a joke or a story, making everyone laugh, even Amara, who rarely showed any emotion outside of politeness. Tobi found himself smiling genuinely again, something he hadn't done in so long. But it didn't feel right. He knew it didn't. One evening, as they all gathered around the dinner table, Zara told a story about her time in New York, laughing freely as she described her adventures. Her joy was contagious, spreading across the table, lifting everyone's spirits. Tobi couldn't help but smile. He felt the warmth of it, the kind of warmth he hadn't felt in years. But when their eyes met, just for a moment, the warmth vanished. It was replaced by something heavier. The weight of a look that lingered too long. A look that neither of them acknowledged but both felt. Tobi's heart skipped a beat, and his stomach twisted with guilt. His mind raced. This wasn't right. She was his wife's sister. She was family. Yet, in that moment he couldn't deny the attraction that pulsed between them. Amara, ever the observer, noticed the pause. She looked up from her plate, her eyes narrowing as she studied her husband and her sister. Tobi could feel her gaze on him, but he didn't dare look at her. After the dinner, Tobi retreated to his study, trying to escape the tension that had thickened in the air. The guilt gnawed at him. He couldn't keep doing this. Zara had already begun to shift something inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. He grabbed a glass of whiskey and took a long sip, letting the warmth burn down his throat. But it did nothing to soothe the storm inside him. His thoughts kept returning to Zara, the way her eyes sparkled when she laughed, how her presence seemed to fill the room with light, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. The next morning, Tobi stood in front of his bathroom mirror, staring at his reflection. He didn't look any different, but he felt as if he were becoming someone else. Someone he didn't recognize. He was no longer the man who could control every aspect of his life, his emotions. Now he was losing himself, piece by piece, and the person he was losing himself to was Zara. Her laugh, her touch, her presence, everything about her had wormed its way into his thoughts. She made him feel things he hadn't felt in so long, and that scared him more than anything else. He stepped away from the mirror, running a hand through his hair. He needed to fix this. He needed to stop whatever was happening between them before it went any further. But the more he tried to suppress it, the more it grew. A knock on the door startled him from his thoughts. He walked out of the bathroom to find Amara standing at the doorframe, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said softly, her voice tinged with a seriousness that made Tobi's stomach tighten. Tobi swallowed, suddenly aware of how heavy the air between them had become. He had no idea what Amara had noticed, but he didn't have the courage to face her right now. About what? Amara stepped into the room, her eyes locking onto his with a quiet intensity. "About you, Tobi. About what's been going on with you lately." He tried to maintain his composure, but it was harder now than ever. The guilt he had been suppressing was rising up inside him, threatening to spill over. "There's nothing to talk about," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. Amara didn't flinch. "I don't know what's going on, but you've been distant for days. Is it Zara?" Her voice barely broke a whisper on the last word, but it felt like a shot through the silence. Tobi's chest tightened. He could feel the walls closing in around him. He couldn't tell her the truth. He couldn't explain what was happening inside him. "No," he lied, his voice coming out too easily, too calm. "It's nothing. Just work." But Amara wasn't buying it. "Don't lie to me, Tobi," she said, her eyes narrowing, the edge in her voice cutting through the fog of confusion in his mind. "I know you better than anyone. And I know when something's wrong." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the unspoken words hung in the air, suffocating. Finally, Amara turned to leave, but before she reached the door, she glanced back at him. "If you're not careful, Tobi, you'll lose us both." That evening, Tobi found himself walking past the piano room. He had no intention of going inside. But as he approached, the soft sound of piano music drifted out into the hallway, stopping him in his tracks. It was Zara. He recognized the tune immediately, the same song that had played during their wedding reception all those years ago. It was a song Tobi had always loved, a song that had meant something special to him and Amara. But now, hearing it come from Zara's fingertips, it felt like something else entirely. Tobi hesitated at the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He stood there for a moment, listening, his eyes closing as the notes washed over him. There was something about the way she played it, so effortlessly, so emotionally, that struck a chord deep within him. He had to leave. He had to get away from the piano, from her. He couldn't be this close to her anymore, couldn't feel this way. But his feet wouldn't move. He was frozen, caught between the guilt of his emotions and the pull of something he couldn't name. Zara's fingers paused on the keys, and then she looked up. Her eyes met his, and for a brief, terrifying moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. The silence between them was thick, heavy. "Uncle Tobi," Zara said softly, her voice like a whisper, "are you all right?" Tobi opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He couldn't do this. Not now, not like this. He cleared his throat, his voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to interrupt." Zara smiled, but it was soft, almost sad. "You didn't? I was just playing." Tobi nodded, his chest tight. "It's beautiful," he said, barely able to get the words out. For a moment, neither of them moved. Tobi stood at the door, his body frozen, his mind racing. Zara simply sat at the piano, her hands resting on the keys as if waiting for something, waiting for him to do something. Finally, Tobi turned and left, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. He couldn't do this. He couldn't let it happen. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that it already had. The storm had rolled in quickly, unexpected and fierce. The rain slammed against the windows of the mansion, the wind howling as if it, too, was frustrated by the tension that hung thick in the air. Tobi sat by the fireplace, his gaze flicking over the storm, but his mind was far from the weather. It was on Zara. Always on Zara. Her presence in the house was both a blessing and a curse. Every laugh, every glance, every moment of warmth she gave him seemed to unearth the cold, hollow part of him that had been dormant for years. He had never expected her return to affect him so deeply. She wasn't just filling the gaps in his life, she was exposing them. And as much as he tried to ignore it, as much as he tried to push the guilt away, the feelings were only growing stronger. Tonight was supposed to be no different. A quiet evening. But as the wind whipped through the trees, the atmosphere inside the house felt charged, almost suffocating. Tobi was supposed to be reviewing business plans, but his eyes kept drifting toward the grand staircase where Zara had just passed by. He caught a glimpse of her in the hallway, her silhouette illuminated by the light from the hallway chandelier. The way her hair fell over her shoulders, the soft sway of her figure, it pulled at him, a magnet he couldn't resist. He tried to focus on the papers in front of him, but his thoughts kept circling back to her. She'd been so distant since that night in the piano room. They hadn't spoken about what had happened, and neither of them had acknowledged the tension that had settled between them. But it was there. Between every glance, every exchange. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Zara standing in the doorway, her eyes bright but cautious. The sight of her took his breath away as it always did. She was wearing a sweater that clung to her figure, the soft fabric contrasting with the tension in the room. She smiled, but it was hesitant, as if she were unsure of her place here now. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice soft yet commanding in its simplicity. Tobi stood up from his chair, feeling his pulse quicken. Of course, he replied, his voice steadier than he felt. Zara stepped inside and for a brief moment there was silence. The kind of silence that felt heavy with meaning. She moved toward the fire, her eyes briefly catching his as she passed. Tobi could feel the air thicken, the space between them shrinking. "Nice night for a storm," she said, though her voice was distracted as if she were searching for something to say. "I wasn't sure if you were busy." "I'm always busy," Tobi replied, but his eyes never left her. He couldn't tear himself away. "But there's no harm in taking a break." Zara smiled, but the smile was softer now, almost vulnerable. She walked over to the armchair opposite his, settling down with a sigh. Tobi could see the weariness in her eyes, something that wasn't usually there. It reminded him that she wasn't just this vibrant force of energy, there was depth to her, something hidden beneath the surface. "I've been thinking," Zara began, her voice soft, her eyes meeting his for a moment. "About everything. About us." Tobi's heart skipped a beat. He knew exactly what she meant, but he couldn't bring himself to say it, to acknowledge the shift that had happened between them. Instead, he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "You've been distant," she said, her gaze holding his, unflinching. "Ever since I got back. I don't know what's going on, but it feels different." Tobi swallowed, the weight of her words pressing down on him. It was hard to look at her, because when he did, the desire he felt for her was almost overwhelming. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between them, but he couldn't. He didn't trust himself. "Zara, Tobi started, but she cut him off with a shake of her head. "You don't have to explain anything to me," she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. I don't know how to act around you anymore. It's like there's this wall." Tobi's chest tightened. He could feel it too. The wall that had come up between them, despite the undeniable connection that had always existed, was now more like a chasm. It wasn't just the guilt, it was the way Zara made him feel. Alive. Excited. Unseen in the most painful, beautiful way. "I don't know what's happening," he admitted, his voice low. "But I don't want to make this harder than it already is." Zara stood up slowly, her movement deliberate, almost as if she were weighing each step. She walked toward the window, standing just a few feet from Tobi, her back to him as she stared out into the storm. "I feel it too," she said quietly, her voice almost lost to the sound of the rain. "This pull. And I don't know how to handle it. I don't know what to do." Tobi's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to reach out, to touch her, to tell her everything he felt, but the fear that gripped him held him in place. Zara turned to face him, her eyes dark with unshed emotions. "You're married, Tobi. You have a life, a family. I can't be the reason things fall apart. I won't do that to you." Her words hit him like a physical blow. The guilt that had been gnawing at him for days now settled in his chest, making it hard to breathe. He was trapped between two worlds, one that was safe, predictable, and suffocating, and another that was dangerous, exhilarating, and full of everything he had denied himself for years. "You're not the reason," Tobi said quietly, his voice rough. "I am." Zara stepped back as if his words had shocked her. She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face as though looking for something she couldn't find. "You're confused," she said softly, her voice a mixture of understanding and something deeper, something more raw. "You've been living with this emptiness and now you think I can fill it." "I never asked for this," Tobi replied, his chest tightening. "I never thought it would happen. But I can't deny it anymore. Not to you. Not to myself." The room felt smaller. The air thicker. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside him, and Zara's presence was the lightning that was making everything flash to life. She stepped closer to him, the distance between them closing. Her hand reached out, lightly brushing his, sending a shock of electricity through him. "You need to figure this out," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Before it's too late." And in that moment, as they stood just inches apart, Tobi realized that there was no going back. The fire between them had already been lit, and it was burning with a force he couldn't control. Later that night the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and the only sound was the storm outside and the distant rumbles of thunder. Tobi stood in the living room, his mind swirling with confusion and longing. He moved toward the window, trying to steady his breathing. But the storm inside him raged on. Zara was right. He needed to figure this out. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he might already be too far gone. And as the lights flickered back on, Tobi's eyes met Zara's across the room. She was standing in the doorway, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of sadness and understanding. Neither of them said anything. but the silence between them spoke volumes. The mansion was quieter than usual. The storm from the previous night had passed, but the air inside felt as heavy as the dark clouds that had swept through. Tobi stood by the window, staring out at the manicured gardens, but his mind was far from the view. It was on Zara. It was always on Zara. The warmth she brought into the house, the laughter she shared, it was like she had breathed life into the cold, sterile environment he had created around himself. But now everything had changed. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Tobi's relationship with Amara had always been one of routine, safe, predictable. But now, every glance at Zara, every fleeting moment where their eyes met, tore at the fabric of that routine. He had convinced himself for weeks that he could control it, that the feelings would go away. But they hadn't. And now he was beginning to fear they never would. He hadn't spoken to Zara alone in days. He couldn't. After the night by the fire, after the brief moments of connection they had shared, Tobi had retreated into the safety of his routine. But that didn't stop the thoughts from flooding in day and night. And today he knew he couldn't keep running from them. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see Amara standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Tobi, we need to talk," she said, her voice low, almost rehearsed. She stood there waiting for him to respond, but Tobi could already feel the weight of what was coming. He nodded silently, stepping back from the window. "About what?" Amara stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The tension in the room was palpable, the silence almost suffocating. She didn't sit down immediately. Instead, she crossed her arms, eyes narrowing as she studied him. "It's about Zara," she said flatly, her words coming out like a slow burn. "I know something's going on, Tobi. I'm not blind. I can see how the two of you have been looking at each other." Tobi froze. His heart hammered in his chest, the blood rushing to his ears. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His mind scrambled for an explanation, but there was no simple excuse. Amara had already seen it. She already knew. "I don't know what you're talking about," he managed to say, his voice hoarse, but it sounded weak even to his own ears. Amara's lips curled into a cold, humorless smile. "You don't have to lie to me, Tobi. I've seen how you look at her. The way she looks at you. The way you're both avoiding the truth." The guilt settled over Tobi like a stone, heavy and suffocating. How could he explain this? How could he explain the impossible pull he felt toward Zara? She was his wife's sister, nothing more than a distant connection. And yet, every time he saw her, every time she spoke to him, it was like everything else faded into the background. "I never meant for it to happen," Tobi said, his voice barely above a whisper. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "It's complicated. I don't know what's happening anymore." Amara's eyes softened for a moment, but it was only brief. "You need to make a choice, Tobi. Because if you don't, I will." Tobi felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" "I'm not going to sit here and watch my sister destroy my marriage," Amara said, her voice sharp now. "She's been here for what? A few weeks, and already, it's like you've forgotten who I am. I won't let her come between us." Tobi stood there stunned. It was the first time he'd seen Amara speak so openly about their marriage. There had always been an unspoken understanding between them, an agreement to never discuss the cracks they both knew existed. But now it was all out in the open. "I haven't forgotten you, Amara," Tobi said, his voice breaking slightly. "I'm just confused." "Confused?" Amara's voice rose. "Don't you dare play the confused card with me, Tobi. You've known what you're doing all along. And I'm not going to stand by while you destroy everything we've built. I'm not." The room fell into silence, the tension thick and unbearable. Tobi could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air, suffocating him. He had never seen Amara like this, so raw, so vulnerable. It was like she had been holding everything inside for years and now it was spilling out all at once. "I don't want to lose you," Tobi said quietly, but the words felt empty, hollow. He had said them so many times before, but this time he wasn't sure if he even meant them. "You've already lost me," Amara replied, her voice breaking. She took a deep breath, regaining her composure. "And if you don't make a choice, Tobi, you'll lose everything. I can't keep living like this." "I won't." Amara turned and left the room, her footsteps echoing in the hallway, but Tobi remained standing, staring at the door she had just closed. The weight of her words hung over him, crushing him under its enormity. His marriage was hanging by a thread, and the thing that threatened to tear it apart was the very woman he was forbidden to want. Hours passed before Tobi could bring himself to face Zara. His mind was a mess, spinning with confusion and guilt, but he knew what he had to do. It was the only way to preserve what little he had left. Amara had made her feelings clear. She wouldn't stand for this, she couldn't. And Tobi couldn't blame her. He couldn't blame anyone but himself. Tobi found Zara in the living room, standing by the window, staring out into the now calm evening. Her back was turned to him, but he could see the tension in her posture. She knew something was wrong even if she didn't know exactly what. "Zara," Tobi said, his voice raw. She turned around at the sound of his voice, her eyes searching his face. "What's going on, Tobi?" Her voice was soft, but there was an edge of concern that he couldn't ignore. "What happened?" Tobi hesitated. How could he say this? How could he tell her the truth when everything inside him was screaming to ignore it? But Amara was right. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. "Amara knows. She's been watching us. She knows what's happening." Zara's face fell, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. "What do you mean?" "Tobi, I can't do this anymore," Tobi said quickly, his words rushing out in a flood. "I can't let this destroy everything. I have a life with Amara, and no matter how I feel, I can't betray that." Zara stepped back, her eyes searching his face for some sign that this wasn't happening. But there was no mistaking the seriousness in his tone. "You're asking me to leave," she said softly, the hurt clear in her voice. Tobi couldn't bring himself to say the words, but they hung between them like a dark cloud. The truth was there, undeniable. This wasn't something that could continue. He had to let her go. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "But it's the only way." Zara stood frozen, her face pale as she absorbed his words. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She simply nodded slowly as if the reality of it had already settled in. Without saying another word, she turned and walked out of the room. Tobi stood there, feeling like his world was crumbling around him. He had made the choice, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end. Later that night, Tobi drove Zara to the airport. The car ride was silent, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them both. Zara had not spoken a word since their conversation, and Tobi had no idea what to say. When they arrived at the airport, Zara turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I understand now," she said quietly. "It wasn't love we felt. It was life trying to wake you up." Tobi felt something shift inside him, a part of him breaking. He wanted to say more, but the words caught in his throat. Zara turned and walked into the terminal without looking back. As Tobi sat in the car, staring out into the night, he realized the truth. He had lost her. And it was his fault. The house felt too quiet. Tobi sat at the breakfast table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold long ago. He stared at the cup, barely noticing it as his mind replayed the events of the past few days. Zara was gone. He had sent her away, had told her it was the only way. But now, the silence in the house was deafening. Amara hadn't spoken much since Zara's departure. The two of them had exchanged only short, polite words. She had made no attempt to comfort him, and he hadn't tried to reach out to her. They were two strangers sitting in the same house, pretending that nothing had changed when everything had. Tobi looked at the seat across from him where Amara usually sat, but now it was empty. She was upstairs, getting ready for her day the same as she always did. But there was a difference now, a distance between them that had never been there before. Tobi felt it, thick and suffocating, as if an invisible wall had been built between them. Amara had tried to talk to him after the confrontation about Zara, but the words never seemed to come. They had settled into a routine of silence, both of them knowing the truth but unwilling to speak it aloud. A soft sound from the hallway broke his thoughts. It was Amara, walking into the kitchen with her usual composure, as if nothing had happened. She was dressed for work, her expression serene but distant. The same cold perfection she always wore. Tobi looked at her, searching for any sign of the woman he had married, the woman he had once loved. But all he saw now was a stranger, someone he barely recognized. "Good morning," Amara said, her voice polite but distant. Tobi nodded, forcing a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He wasn't sure what to say anymore. How could he say the right words when everything between them had changed? "How did you sleep?" Amara asked, sitting down at the table. Her eyes flickered briefly to his, but she quickly looked away. "I'm fine," Tobi replied automatically. He wasn't fine, not at all, but there was no point in explaining. Not to her. "Amara," he began, his voice low. "We need to talk." She looked at him then, her expression hardening. "I thought we already had that conversation." "I mean about everything," Tobi said, his hands trembling slightly as he placed the coffee cup back on the table. "About what's happening between us." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "What's happening, Tobi?" is that you made a choice. You chose to send Zara away and now you have to live with the consequences. We both do. Her words cut through him like a blade and he flinched involuntarily. He hadn't wanted this. He hadn't wanted to hurt her. But he had. I'm sorry, he said, the words feeling hollow in his mouth. I didn't want it to come to this. Amara's eyes softened for a moment, but the sadness in her gaze only deepened. I don't know who you are anymore, Tobi. I don't know what we are. Tobi opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. He couldn't explain what had happened, what had drawn him to Zara, and why he couldn't shake the pull. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't undo what he had done. I've tried, Amara, he said, his voice breaking. I've tried to fix this. But I don't know how. The silence between them stretched on, each word unsaid hanging heavier than the last. Finally, Amara stood up, walking toward the door. I need some time, she said, her voice cold again. I need space to think. Tobi nodded, watching her walk away, the echo of her footsteps fading as she went upstairs. He stared at the door, his chest tight, the weight of everything pressing down on him. It felt like the walls were closing in and he couldn't breathe. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Tobi went through the motions, meetings, calls, emails, but nothing registered. His mind kept returning to Zara. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had made the wrong choice. That sending her away had been a betrayal, not just of her, but of himself. The guilt gnawed at him, relentless and unforgiving. He found himself standing in the hallway, looking up at the staircase that led to the rooms above. There was a quiet tension in the air, a silence that felt louder than any argument they could have had. He knew Amara was in their bedroom, likely packing for a trip or preparing for the day, but the space between them had grown so vast, it seemed impossible to bridge. Zara had been the one to make him feel alive again, the one to remind him what it was like to feel something real. And now she was gone. He had let her slip away because he had been too afraid to face the truth. He had chosen to stay with Amara to keep the life they had built, but in doing so, he had lost something far more important, himself. That evening, Tobi sat alone in the living room, the house still and quiet. He could hear the faint sound of Amara moving upstairs, the rustle of clothes or papers, but there was no conversation. No laughter. No warmth. Just silence. The silence had become unbearable. He glanced over at the door to the study where Zara had once stood, her laughter filling the space. He could almost hear it in his head, her voice, her carefree energy, the way she had made him feel alive in a way he hadn't experienced in years. She was gone now, and with her went the spark that had ignited his soul. Tobi stood up abruptly, a sense of urgency driving him forward. He needed to get out of this house. He needed to escape the suffocating silence, the weight of the decisions he had made. He grabbed his jacket and left the house, stepping into the cool night air. The city felt alive around him, the hum of activity, the distant sound of traffic, the life of the world outside. But he felt nothing. He was numb. His phone buzzed in his pocket and Tobi pulled it out to see a message from Zara. His heart skipped a beat, but he didn't open it immediately. Instead, he stared at the screen, his finger hovering over the message. Why am I doing this? He whispered to himself. Why did I let it all slip away? Finally, he opened the message. Zara. I hope you're finding peace, Tobi. I understand now. It wasn't love we felt. It was life trying to wake you up. Don't forget that. Tobi stared at the words, feeling a lump form in his throat. Was he supposed to find peace in all of this? In the pain, the guilt, the decisions he had made? He walked through the streets, his mind lost in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to call Zara, to beg her to come back, to fix everything. But another part of him knew that wasn't possible. He had broken something inside of himself and no one else could fix it. The next morning, Tobi sat in the kitchen, the mug of coffee in front of him cold and untouched. The silence between him and Amara had only deepened. She had barely spoken to him, had barely looked at him. And Tobi didn't know how to fix it. He didn't know how to fix anything anymore. When Amara finally walked into the kitchen, her expression was as cold as it had been the day before. She didn't acknowledge him at first, moving around the kitchen as if he weren't there. Tobi cleared his throat. Amara, he began softly, his voice raw with emotion. We can't keep doing this. We can't keep pretending that everything's fine. Amara didn't look at him. She didn't even pause. I'm not pretending, she said quietly. I'm just tired, Tobi. Tired of everything. Tobi swallowed, the weight of her words crashing down on him. He knew this was it. He had made his choice and now there was no going back. Amara walked out of the room without another word, leaving Tobi alone with his thoughts.